April 22nd, 1985. Vinita Park, Missouri. 27-year-old wife and mother Linda Sherman does not show up for her shift at work, and her abandoned car is soon discovered in an airport parking garage. Since Linda had recently filed for divorce from her controlling husband, Don Sherman, he is suspected of being responsible for her disappearance. 5 years later, a skull is found outside Don's favorite restaurant, and after it is kept in an evidence room for 14 months, police receive an anonymous note confirming that the skull belongs to Linda. In spite of this, Don maintains his innocence, and the rest of Linda's body is never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a pretty bizarre case to cover today. The 1985 disappearance and death of Linda Sherman. This story was featured on one of the later seasons of Unsolved Mysteries, and needless to say, that show had no shortage of cases where a woman went missing under suspicious circumstances, and the finger was pointed directly at the husband. In this particular case, Linda Sherman had been trapped in an unhappy, tumultuous marriage with her controlling husband, Don Sherman, so when Linda vanished without a trace shortly after she filed for divorce, it wasn't too surprising that Don became the subject of suspicion. But this story is a little different from the norm. 5 years after Linda went missing, a skull was discovered outside her estranged husband's favorite restaurant and was eventually identified as belonging to her. To this day, the rest of Linda's remains have never been found, and no one knows who was responsible for placing her skull in a public place or why they did it. While there definitely is good reason to be suspicious of Don Sherman, if he was guilty, you have to wonder what would motivate him to take the huge risk of digging up his wife's skull 5 years after he murdered her and turning the case into such a public spectacle. This would mean that Don is either incredibly brazen or completely innocent, or perhaps there was someone else involved in this crime we don't even know about. So we're going to explore all the different possible scenarios on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unexplained death of Linda Sherman. Our story begins in 1985 in Vinita Park, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Our central figure is 27-year-old Linda Sherman, who is married to her husband, Don Sherman, and the couple have a 9-year-old daughter named Patty. The couple were high school sweethearts when Linda became pregnant, so they decided to get married in February of 1975 when they were both only 17 years old. At the time, Linda was a junior and Don was a senior, and they moved into a rented house located next door to Linda's parents. Linda gave birth to Patty in August of that year, but was determined to complete her senior year of high school while her mother helped her take care of her newborn baby. By this point, Don had graduated, so he took a job as an assistant manager at a gas station in order to support his new wife and child, but the marriage would be fraught with turmoil. The couple often had money problems and were usually forced to work opposite shifts at their jobs. Don eventually started working in a machine shop, while Linda got a night job working data entry at the U.S. Government Records Center in St. Louis. Don was known for being jealous and possessive and having a violent temper, and he would often get angry whenever he saw Linda talking to other guys, including her own brothers. Over the course of the next 10 years, Linda would take Patty and move out multiple times, even going so far as to file for divorce from Don in 1977. But Linda never followed through with her divorce, and by the 1980s, she had reconciled with Don, and the family moved into a new home in Vinita Park. However, the marriage became even more troubled when Linda suffered a miscarriage and experienced some epileptic seizures, which ultimately made her decide not to have any more children. In 1982, Linda and Patty moved out again and filed an order of protection against Don, claiming that he had tampered with her car and even threatened to commit a murder-suicide in which he would take their daughter's life as well. Don did admit that he disabled Linda's car on one occasion in order to prevent her from driving it, but denied that he had any intention of harming her. While Linda's order of protection was granted, she reconciled with Don again and moved back in with him. By the time 1985 rolled around, Linda told her family she had finally made the decision to end the marriage for good. She officially filed for divorce on April 11th and had all of her mail, including her paychecks, forwarded to the home of her sister and brother-in-law, Fran and Sam Miller. Since it would be weeks before Don was served with divorce papers, Linda decided to remain living in their house with them, but planned to take Patty and move out soon. At 2:16 a.m. on Monday, April the 22nd, Linda signed out after her night shift ended at the U.S. Government Records Center. According to Don, Linda did not arrive home until around 3 o'clock, and they proceeded to get into another argument, as Don demanded to know where Linda had been and why she was late. Don would claim that Linda had developed a habit of not coming home from work on multiple occasions, and there were times when he would call the house from work and Linda would not be there. At the time, Don suspected that Linda was having an affair with a male co-worker, as one of the truck drivers from his workplace had recently seen them together. After the couple's argument came to an end, Don said that he finally went to bed at around 4 a.m., while Linda went to sleep on the couch. A few hours later, Patty woke up, and even though her mother was the one who generally drove her to school, Don would be the one to do so on this particular morning. Patty claimed that as she was leaving the house, she saw Linda lying on the couch with her back turned. Patty did not recall seeing any movements from Linda, who did not even get up to say goodbye to her, which seemed uncharacteristic. When Patty left the house, this would turn out to be the last time she ever saw her mother. Don would claim that he returned home at 6 p.m. that night and was surprised to find that Linda was still there. He said that she was in a frantic mood because she was running late for work and quickly drove away. However, Linda never showed up for her shift, did not call her employer to let her know she wasn't going to be there, and she did not return home. At first, Don was not fearful of Linda's safety, as he suspected she was having an affair and figured she may have run off with another man. Don would later say that he believed an overnight bag and some of Linda's personal items appeared to be missing from their house. However, when Fran and Sam Miller were unable to reach Linda and learned she had not shown up for work, they immediately became concerned. They did not believe Don's story about Linda running off with another man because they could not imagine Linda abandoning her daughter. In the past, whenever Linda separated from Don and moved out, she always took Patty with her. The Millers demanded that Don go to the police and file a missing persons report, and he finally did so on April 24th, 2 days after she was last seen. Fran and Sam began performing their own search for Linda, and on a hunch, they decided to go check out St. Louis Lambert International Airport on April 26th. After pulling into the short-term parking garage, they were surprised to discover Linda's yellow 1971 Volkswagen in one of the spaces. The car was locked, but some of Linda's possessions, including her hat and school books from a computer class she was taking, could be seen inside. The Millers immediately contacted the airport police, who noticed that the car's trunk was unlocked, so they decided to open it. While Fran and Sam experienced a brief moment of fear that Linda's body might be inside the trunk, it turned out to be empty. The airport kept track of all cars which were placed in the short-term garage longer than 24 hours, and since Linda's Volkswagen was first noted on April 24th, this meant it was likely left in the garage sometime on the 23rd or earlier. However, there was no listing for a Linda Sherman on any of the flights which departed the airport during that time period. Once again, Linda's family did not believe she would have flown off somewhere and abandoned Patty, so they suspected her car was planted in the garage. Of course, suspicion immediately turned towards Don, as there were no other witnesses to verify his claim that Linda had left their house at 6 p.m. on April 22nd. Other than Don, the last confirmed sighting of Linda was when Patty saw her lying on the couch when she left for school, but since she never saw her mother make any movements, there was a genuine fear that Linda may have already been dead by that point. But Don would soon tell police that he saw Linda in the passenger seat of a van being driven by an unidentified male a few days after she originally went missing. Don claimed that as the van was driving past him, he called out to them, prompting Linda to duck out of sight. Don said that he did make an attempt to follow the van, but quickly lost it and was unable to get the license number. Investigators did check into the male co-worker, whom Don had alleged was having an affair with Linda, but he had a solid alibi and was ruled out as a suspect. Don eventually filed a cross petition for divorce on the grounds that Linda had abandoned both him and their daughter, but since she could not be found, a judge dismissed Don's divorce filing in June of 1989. The investigation remained at a complete standstill until the case took a very unexpected turn 1 year later. On June 28, 1990, a pair of flight attendants were having lunch at Casa Gallardo, a Mexican restaurant in the St. Louis suburb of Bridgeton, when they looked out the window and noticed what appeared to be a human skull underneath a yucca plant and the bushes outside. The skull was directly facing the window, which seemed to suggest that whoever planted it there wanted someone to find it. The Bridgeton Police Department were notified, and the skull was sent to the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office, who determined that it likely belonged to an adult female and was of recent origin. However, the police did not initially suspect foul play. At the time, a cemetery in the area was being relocated, which involved the exhumation and transport of numerous bodies, so they theorized that perhaps someone had taken the skull from one of the graves and left it outside the restaurant as a prank. Since the skull could not be identified, it was placed inside the county morgue's evidence room and remained there for over a year. On September 6, 1991, the Vinita Park Police Department received an unsealed envelope with no return address containing a flyer for the Casa Gallardo restaurant. The flyer had a message stamped on it in purple ink: "The Bridgeton Police have L. Sherman skull." Well, the Vinita Park PD contacted the Bridgeton PD, and sure enough, they learned that they had a skull in their possession, which had been found outside Casa Gallardo. This anonymous message now made the Vinita Park PD suspect that the skull might belong to Linda Sherman, who had been missing for the past 6 years. After checking dental records, investigators were able to confirm that it was Linda. It would also turn out that the Casa Gallardo happened to be Don Sherman's favorite restaurant, as he was known for hanging out and drinking at their bar 2 or 3 times per week. In fact, Don even remembered coming into the restaurant on the very same day the skull was found and hearing about the incident. Don believed that the reappearance of Linda's skull was proof that he was not responsible for what happened to her, and someone else intentionally left it there in order to send some sort of message to him. However, some people suspected that Don could have retrieved the skull and planted it outside the restaurant in order to draw suspicion away from himself. But if so, what would compel Don to do something like that after 5 years? Well, the prevalent theory was that Don may have been planning to get remarried, but since he had no luck legally divorcing Linda in absentia, he decided to retrieve her skull so there would be concrete evidence to have her declared legally dead. Don denied these allegations, but in spite of this new development in the case, there was no additional evidence to prove or disprove that he was involved in Linda's death. The envelope and flyer that had been sent to police were given a forensic analysis, but they contained no fingerprints, and since the envelope was unsealed, there was no saliva which could be used for DNA testing. The rubber stamp which had been used to write out the message on the flyer could have easily been purchased at an office supply store. In 1999, Linda's skull was exhumed and shipped to the Archaeological Institute of Mercyhurst College in Erie, Pennsylvania. One of the professors from the college had actually been called upon to assist the federal government with prosecuting archaeological theft cases as their soil analysis techniques could successfully link soil samples found on items to the locations where they originated from. Investigators hoped that by performing soil analysis on some dirt attached to Linda's skull, they might have been able to determine where the rest of her remains were buried. I have no idea if this decision was related to the soil analysis or not, but at one point, police did send a search team and cadaver-sniffing dogs to an area near the town of Perryville, located 75 miles south of St. Louis, but it doesn't sound like they turned up anything. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in July of 2001, and featured an interview with the Sherman's daughter, Patty, who was now 25 years old and living in Indiana with a husband and daughter of her own. She did not hesitate to express her suspicions about her father's potential culpability in her mother's murder, stating, quote, "In my heart, I think he might have done it. I can't think of anyone else who would have," end quote. For his part, Don never stopped maintaining his innocence, and always suspected that Linda did initially run off with another man, who subsequently murdered her. He got remarried in 1994, and had a daughter with his second wife, along with 2 stepchildren. Don would pass away in July of 2015 at the age of 58, but after nearly 35 years, the exact circumstances of Linda Sherman's death remain unclear. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Now, this is definitely one of the more bizarre spousal disappearances I've ever come across. I mentioned earlier that Unsolved Mysteries had more than its fair share of cases where women went missing while in the midst of a troubled marriage and their husband became the prime suspect. A surprising number of them agreed to be interviewed on camera, and most of the time, they did not come across very well. Don Sherman did not seem like an overly likable person during his Unsolved Mysteries interview, though to be fair, it was filmed over 15 years after he lost his wife, so that might explain why there wasn't much emotion on his part. I definitely don't doubt the allegations that he was a jealous, possessive, and abusive husband, and that Linda would have been much better off not being married to him. And it also looked pretty damning that Don's own daughter, Patty, did not seem reluctant to express her suspicions about him. It's unclear when or if Patty became completely estranged from her father, but I find it interesting that when you look up Don Sherman's obituary online, it mentions his daughter and 2 stepchildren from his second marriage as next of kin, but there is no mention of Patty. Given that Linda split up with Don and moved out multiple times while Patty was growing up, I have no doubt that she may have witnessed some things in that house, which made her think her father was capable of murder. I will say that if Linda simply vanished in 1985 and was still a missing person today, I would have no trouble believing that Don was responsible for her death. However, the appearance of Linda's skull throws a complete monkey wrench into the whole thing. I honestly cannot think of another missing persons case where something like that happened. How many other cold cases are there where a victim's skull popped up in a public place years after they went missing, while the rest of their remains have never been recovered? If Don was guilty, then it's hard to imagine why he would do something like this and what he was trying to accomplish. But if Don is innocent, and somebody else unearthed Linda's skull and left it out in the open, what were they trying to accomplish? However, let's go back and examine the exact circumstances of how Linda went missing. Don's official story is that he got home at around 6 p.m. on the evening of April 22nd, 1985, and saw Linda quickly leaving the house because she was running late for her shift at work. After she drove away, Linda did not show up for her shift and was never seen alive again. But of course, we only have Don's word these events took place, so the last confirmed sighting of Linda is from about 10 to 12 hours earlier, when Patty saw her mother lying on the couch while she was leaving the house for school. And before that, we know that Linda signed out from her final shift at work at 2:16 a.m. Don's story is that they got into an argument because Linda arrived home late, and being the jealous guy that he was, he accused her of being with another man. After their argument subsided, they both went to sleep in separate rooms until Don woke up and took Patty to school a few hours later, which she found unusual since her mother was the one who generally drove her to school. Patty claims that she saw what appeared to be her mother sleeping on the couch, but she did not move at all, so the disturbing implication here is that Don killed Linda after she arrived home from her shift, left her body on the couch, and then disposed of it after he dropped Patty off at school. It sounds like this is one of the main reasons Patty believes her father may have killed her mother, but I don't know. If Don murdered Linda that morning, it seems to me that leaving her body on the couch in full view of their daughter would be an incredibly brazen thing to do. I mean, what if Patty had gone over and tried to wake Linda up? If Don had killed Linda in a fit of rage, I'm sure he knew that he couldn't go somewhere to dispose of her body immediately because Patty would be waking up in only a few hours, so he had to go through the morning routine of taking her to school to give off the impression that everything was still normal. But if Don wanted to conceal what he'd done, I would think that the most logical step would be to place Linda's body in their bedroom, close the door, and tell Patty that her mother was sleeping and didn't want to be woken up, which seems far less risky than leaving her dead body out in the open on the couch. Interestingly enough, Patty was interviewed in an article about the case published in the Riverfront Times in 1999 and described the situation of seeing her mother lying on the couch while leaving for school as a recurring nightmare she often has, which causes her to wake up in tears. Since she was so young when this actual event happened, I have to wonder if Patty's memories of the situation are a bit exaggerated and the passage of time has made her think she was staring at her mother while she was dead. Personally, given that Linda supposedly did not go to sleep until around 4 a.m. or so, I think it's equally as plausible that she was sleeping soundly and simply did not wake up as Patty was leaving. My biggest issue with the idea of Linda being dead by that point is that I'm not entirely sure if Don's whereabouts were accounted for the rest of the day. As far as I can tell, he ordinarily worked the day shift in a machine shop, and since April the 22nd was a Monday, it's reasonable to assume that Don would have been working that day, and presumably went there after he dropped off Patty. If it turned out Don conveniently called in sick, then yes, I can definitely believe he was busy disposing of Linda's body. But if he spent the entire day working until he arrived home at around 6 p.m., then I find it highly unlikely that he left Linda's body lying on the couch the whole time. Of course, this doesn't mean Don is innocent. I'm just saying that if he did kill Linda, it's far more likely it happened after he got home that day rather than in the middle of the night. Remember, Linda officially filed for divorce on April 11th, but decided to remain in the house with Don because she knew he wouldn't get served the divorce papers for a few weeks. Well, since April the 22nd was a Monday, what if Don finally got served the papers that day, or somehow learned about Linda's plans to divorce him? This could have put him in such a violent rage that he got into a fight with Linda after he returned home, and wound up killing her in a crime of passion before she had a chance to leave for her night shift. To cover up the crime, Don takes Linda's body and disposes of it somewhere, and then abandons her Volkswagen in the parking garage at Lambert International Airport in order to make it look like she took off voluntarily. Don did mention that he thought an overnight bag and some of Linda's personal items were missing from the house, but he could have either been lying or gotten rid of these items in order to help make his story look more plausible. Of course, there are a number of missing persons cases in which the victim's vehicle is found in an airport parking lot, but the majority of the time, it seems obvious that the vehicle was planted there by the perpetrator to give off the false impression that the victim took a flight somewhere. The main reason no one believed that Linda took off is because they felt there was no way she would have abandoned her daughter. In the past, Linda had separated from Don and moved out with Patty on multiple occasions, and was always prepared to fight for legal custody of her. But now that she had begun the legal process of filing for divorce and was planning to end the marriage for real, was she really just going to skip town and leave her daughter alone with her abusive husband? The only person who seemed to think that Linda took off voluntarily was Don. He was convinced that Linda was having an affair with another man, and acted pretty nonchalant when she turned up missing. Now, it's never been 100% confirmed that Linda was having an affair, though Don once said in an interview that she had cheated on him in the past. He did specifically point to one of Linda's male co-workers, and while it's unclear if the allegations about an affair are true or not, this man was investigated by police and ruled out as a suspect. Regardless, Don seemed pretty certain that Linda was involved with someone, and believed this person was ultimately responsible for her murder. As you recall, Don would later tell police he saw Linda inside a van being driven by an unidentified man a few days after she went missing, and she ducked down to avoid being seen by him. But of course, no one else but Don could corroborate this sighting, and once again, even if Linda really was seeing someone else, would she really have abandoned Patty for this person? It would be one thing if Don said it looked like Linda was being held against her will inside the van, but his story made it sound like she was there voluntarily and was making a deliberate attempt not to be seen by him. There's definitely good reason to be skeptical about Don's story, though in his defense, if Don was the one who planted Linda's car in the airport parking garage in order to give off the impression that she traveled somewhere, it is odd that he would fabricate a sighting of her a few days later, which implied she was still in town. But before we talk about the discovery of Linda's skull, let's discuss what happened during the 5 years in between, as Don made an attempt to file for divorce from Linda on the grounds of abandonment. Now, when he was still a teenager, Don had a pretty terrible tragedy happen in his family. In February of 1974, Don's mother was indicted for first-degree murder after shooting his father with a .38 caliber gun during a heated argument, and Don and his siblings were home at the time this happened. Don's parents were both alcoholics, so it sounds like their marriage was a ticking time bomb, but his mother ultimately wound up pleading guilty to manslaughter and only had to serve 6 months in the county jail. Now, what's interesting is that Don's mother was represented by a public defender named Frank Anzalone, who went on to become a prominent criminal defense attorney who was somewhat notorious for his willingness to defend clients who most other lawyers were unwilling to touch. Over a decade after defending Don's mother, Anzalone wound up representing Don himself when he requested an uncontested divorce from Linda after she went missing. By this point, Anzalone mostly handled violent felonies, so it seemed unusual that he would be handling a divorce case, but then his client was suspected of potentially murdering his spouse. Anyway, as you'll recall, Linda had filed for divorce from Don less than 2 weeks before she went missing, so her attorney refused to consent to an uncontested divorce in her absence. He actually wanted to take a deposition from Don, but this never took place, since Anzalone told him, quote, "We will just plead the fifth." So it looks like Don really wanted a divorce from Linda, but not so much that he was willing to go under oath and be asked questions which he might not have been comfortable answering. As a result, the divorce filing was dismissed in June of 1989, which meant the Shermans' marriage was still legally intact, and it would be exactly 1 year later when Linda's skull suddenly appeared outside the Casa Gallardo restaurant. I'm sure it was no accident that the skull was left in front of Don's favorite restaurant at that time, a location where he hung out multiple times per week. This suggests that either Don himself planted the skull, or it was someone else who was taunting him. If it was Don, then he was essentially attempting to give himself an alibi by placing it outside the establishment because he wound up learning about the discovery of the skull when he visited the bar later that day and acted surprised. So now he could say, "Why would I be stupid enough to dig up my murdered wife's skull and leave it outside my favorite restaurant?" But if Don was responsible, the obvious question is, why would he do something like this? The theory put forward at that time is that Don wanted to get remarried, and since his attempts to divorce Linda in absentia were rejected, he dug up her skull and left it in a public place so that she could finally be declared legally dead. Well, the biggest problem with that theory is that Linda's skull could not be identified at first, so it remained in a morgue evidence room for 14 months until the Vinita Park PD received an anonymous note which read, "The Bridgeton police have Al Sherman's skull." If Don was so anxious to get remarried, why did he wait that long to send an anonymous note to the police to let them know the skull belonged to Linda? To put this into perspective, in most states, a person has to be missing for at least 7 years until they can be declared legally dead. The anonymous note was sent in September of 1991, and the 7-year anniversary of Linda's disappearance would have been in April of 1992. If Don wanted to declare Linda dead so badly, I see no logic in waiting 14 months to send the note, but not bothering to wait 7 more months to declare her dead the traditional way. It's also worth noting that Don finally got married to his second wife in 1994, years after Linda's skull resurfaced, so he really doesn't fit the profile of a man who was in a big hurry to get remarried. But I do concede that Don may have originally been planning to get married to someone else in 1990. In the aforementioned Riverfront Times article from 1999, Michael Webb, the lead investigator on the case, was asked about a rumor that an ex-girlfriend of Don's had claimed he confessed to Linda's murder. Webb simply responded, quote, "I won't deny that. I really can't comment on that aspect." Well, without more information, I can't really comment on that either, but I'm willing to consider the possibility that Don was planning to marry this ex-girlfriend at some point, but she changed her mind when she learned of Don's potential involvement in his wife's murder. As a result, this planned marriage fell through, and the woman Don ultimately married in 1994 was a completely different spouse. But regardless of what Don's motive may have been, digging up Linda's skull would still be an incredibly risky thing for him to do. If Don killed Linda, he had successfully gotten away with it for over 5 years, as even though police had not ruled out Don as a suspect, there was no hard evidence that he had committed a crime. Even after the reappearance of the skull, the rest of Linda's remains could not be found, so whoever killed her did a very effective job at disposing of her body. Since there were traces of dirt on the skull, this implied that Linda was buried somewhere, and that someone had to go through the trouble of digging her up and then reburying the rest of her remains. Again, no matter who did this, that's a lot of needless work to go through, and it really defies all logic. There's also the fact that the reappearance of the skull helped rejuvenate the investigation, which had pretty much hit a dead end for years. If this was just a simple missing persons case, where Linda vanished and was never seen again, it might have been forgotten about a long time ago. But the reappearance of the skull put the case back into the spotlight again, and was such a creepy detail that Unsolved Mysteries just had to do a segment about this. If Don isn't guilty, then I have my doubts that the perpetrator was just some random serial killer, because they made a calculated choice to leave Linda's skull outside her husband's favorite restaurant, and likely did so for the purpose of taunting him. But there's a third possibility. What if Don had an accomplice when he killed Linda, who helped him dispose of the body? Or perhaps it was someone who wasn't directly involved in the crime, but knew exactly what Don had done. This person then made the decision to dig up Linda's skull and leave it in a public place where they knew it would capture Don's attention before they made an attempt to blackmail him and extort money from him. If Don stopped paying or cooperating with this person, that may have motivated their decision to send the police the anonymous letter which revealed that the skull belonged to Linda. However, if they were directly involved in the crime, then they would have stopped short at directly pointing the finger at Don, since they ran the risk of incriminating themselves. While I've kept going on about how risky it was for someone to dig up Linda's skull and leave it in a public place, it ultimately did not actually bring the police any closer to solving this case, so whatever the perpetrator's endgame was, it did not actually backfire on them. If the perpetrator was Don, he managed to successfully get away with it since he passed away in 2015. Part of me thinks that the simplest explanation in this case is the correct one, and that Don killed Linda in a violent rage after finding out she was planning to leave him. If Linda filed for a divorce from her jealous, controlling husband, and wound up being murdered by a completely different person only a few weeks later, then that seems like quite a coincidence. One of the biggest issues with defending Don is even though he maintained that Linda was probably having an affair with another man who did her harm, the investigation has never uncovered any strong alternate suspects. The person who had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit this crime is Don, but yet, I just can't get over the bizarre reappearance of Linda's skull and the anonymous note, which makes me wonder if there might actually be more to this story. It's such a bizarre anomaly that I can't completely commit to the idea of Don being the guilty party. The odds are he probably is, but I'd say I'm only about 60 to 65% certain. If Don did it, perhaps he just got tired of living under the cloud of suspicion about his wife's disappearance, so he decided to dig up her skull and make a public spectacle of the whole thing in an attempt to give off the impression that someone else killed Linda. He did not expect it would take police as long as it did to identify the skull, which is why he decided to send them an anonymous note over 1 year later. So this whole decision may have been motivated by ego rather than an urgent desire to get remarried, because even if Don had successfully gotten away with murder, he just wanted to do something to get everyone to stop thinking of him as a murderer. But even so, the whole situation was completely out of the ordinary, so if it turned out someone else was the killer, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. If Don did it, then there might not be anything else that can be done, since he's currently deceased. But if there's someone else out there who was responsible, then perhaps Linda's family can finally recover the rest of her remains someday and give her a proper burial. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved murder of Linda Sherman, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and we just released a brand new episode last month about the wrongful conviction of Johnny Lee Wilson, which was featured as a final appeal case on Unsolved Mysteries. We also recently implemented a new bonus reward for our patrons in tier 3, in which I've recorded my own audio commentary tracks to be played over episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Anthony and Alyssa Z, Sarah Elizabeth H, Brandon W, and David N and Ginger C. Thank you all so much for your support. And I've also got a special announcement to make. You might remember that last summer, I appeared at a true crime podcasting event at the Hideout Bar in downtown Toronto, and the event turned out to be such a success that we're doing it again in Toronto this summer. Only this time, we're holding the event at the Royal Cinema on August the 18th from 2 p.m. until 5 p.m. Returning to the event this year will be myself, Christy from Canadian True Crime, Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, and Nina from Already Gone, and we're also going to be joined by Aaron from the Generation Y Podcast, which is pretty exciting. The event will include a live show, Q&A, and meet and greet. Tickets are $25 each and have just started to go on sale this week. I've included the link for where to purchase them in our episode description. In addition, for the third consecutive year, I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, being held at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans from June 7th until the 9th. We are only 1 month away from the event, so if you would like to purchase tickets but haven't already done so, we have our own personalized promo code you can use in order to get 10% off a standard badge. So to receive your 10% discount, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code COLD19. That's COLD19. And yes, I am also appearing at another event, the True Crime Podcast Festival, being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July 13th. So to learn more information about this event and to purchase tickets, feel free to visit their website at tcpf2019.com. That's tcpf2019.com. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another new episode of The Trail Went Cold.